Good evening, folks. It's a good day. It's a good day. It's a good day, as that late soul brother John Lewis used to say, and I know y'all know a lot about him. My name is Eddie Carson, and you are listening to Race Matters here at WJOPLP Joppa Radio 96.3. We're going to spend a little bit of time kind of pondering. Well, let's just say I'm going to do a little bit of time doing some pontificating, but I hope you'll kind of delve into the mix as a listener and kind of think about, some of the things that I have to say. We're going to talk about a term that's been on my mind quite a bit. To be honest with you, it's been on my mind for months, and that term is freedom. Freedom means a lot of different things to a lot of different folks, which is really interesting. If you were to travel back in time and talk to slaveholders, they would tell you what freedom means to them in terms of their own prosperity, their own growth, the way they live their livelihood, and what does it mean to be free. They'll go along and they'll pontificate on the notion of freedom here in the most free country on the planet, is what they would tell you. And yet, if you were to turn around and talk to the enslaved folks, they would tell you that they don't know what the word freedom means. They don't know what it means to be a free American. They don't even know how to spell freedom, for the fact that they were not free enough to get the kind of education that was needed in order to do it. They would quickly find the contradictions in the word freedom. Something that'd be quite different, of course, from, let's say, slaveholders, right? And it's interesting as we get to this notion of freedom today, primarily because the term started to come to my mind when I was in a bookstore. And I'll be the first to admit, I don't read right-wing conservative writers' books. I have a lot of books to read, folks. I mean, I am chomping at the bits. I usually knock off a good five, six books a month, and that's still not enough. There's so much. You were to go into my office, if you were to go into my study at home, there are stacks and stacks and stacks of books that I'm trying to get through. And really, to read something in order to understand the point of view of someone who holds the view of slaveholders when it comes to the term freedom does not really relate to me, and particularly in terms of the messaging that I'm trying to get across to. To most people, the meaning of freedom is just as obvious as terms like happiness or love, right? I mean, they're all in many ways very similar, akin to each other. It's when we think about it that gets complicated. And it's a tricky word too. Liberals, folks on the left, and I say folks on the left, I'm not sure if I would really quantify liberals as being on the left, but folks on the left, liberals, conservatives, they probably all view the word freedom very differently. One of the things that comes to my mind is the fact that while in a bookstore, I saw a book, and it was written by Ron DeSantis. And in the title of his book, there's this big word that says freedom on it. And I sat there, and I looked at the cover, and I struggled with that just a little bit. I sat there, and I struggled in the sense that here's a man who is talking about freedom and what freedom means, yet in the process of doing so, he is taking steps to think about what freedom means to businesses, corporations in Florida, individuals, academics, just people who are living their lives, black folks, brown folks, queer folks, women. And his definition of freedom is very different from their definition of freedom. Again, right, I'm just one person, and this is my point of view, and I am going to be quick to say that Ron DeSantis holds the narrative, the view of freedom, much like a slaveholder would. And yet for him, much like the slaveholder, it is different to understand what the word freedom means to those who are enslaved or who were enslaved, or today to those who are feeling a bit marginalized or oppressed because notion of freedom seems to escape them. When we think about freedom, right, that word really means different things when we say it's akin to the question, what is conservatism? And conservatism is a word that has had different iterations for a long period of time. If we'll go back to the days of John Locke and think about classical liberalism, for example, and how that term has changed. And we're not going to get into an academic lesson or any kind of discourse on language, but yet those classical or enlightened writers, however way you want to define those words, that may be worth really thinking about too. What is conservatism then? If we wrestle with the word, what is freedom? Ask two self-identified conservatives, and I am pretty sure that you'll get two different answers. There's no way in the world the answers are going to be identical. Over the past years, in particularly the rise of populism on the American right has provoked a robust conversation about the future of the movement of conservatism. If we think about freedom, are we talking about Donald Trump's definition of freedom? Are we talking about Ron DeSantis' definition of freedom? Because they hold wholly marginalized views on the term freedom to that of those who are feeling marginalized, in a sense that those who espouse freedom are doing everything possible to reject the freedom of other people. We confess the language of freedom, right? They'll say that. They'll come out and they'll say, I'll admit, right? They'll raise their hand and they'll say, I confess this language of what I believe, and they wholeheartedly believe, as some Americans, maybe many Americans, that freedom holds this sense of entitlement to this notion of conservative that oppresses and marginalizes other folks. It makes the word freedom very convoluted, complicated, in a way in which, in truthfully, even myself, I'm not even sure what a conservative is anymore. I haven't understood the word conservative for a long period of time, primarily because when I hear people speak of conservative, they also speak of freedom, whether it's folks down in Georgia like, what is her name? Margie Taylor Greene, who likes to use conservative and freedom all the time, and she talks about how people are trying to take my freedom away, while she's in a process of rejecting a freedom of folks who are feeling oppressed and marginalized and can't live their life the way they want. Or someone like Matt Gaetz down in Florida. Here's a person who propagates notions of family values, like a lot of conservatives do. This is the way we should live our life. This is what we want to do to espouse notions of freedom as we move forward. And yet, he's paying underage girls, underage women for sex. He's caught up in corruption and embezzlement, and you can go on and on and on and on. And yet he, along with other folks, continue to talk about freedom, conservatism, family values, and American way, while rejecting notions of people who want to live within their skin. They want to learn. They want to gain the material aspects that are necessary, but yet are being brought to a halt because one group of people have decided that America is the land of the free. And because we espouse notions of freedom, this is the way it should be. Some conservatives would say, conservatism is about, things such as free enterprise. I'm not too sure that really exists anymore when we think about free enterprise and government. We are talking about things such as balanced budgets, limited government, local autonomy, right? All of these things go hand in hand with both words, freedom and conservatism. And yet, folks, come on, work with a soul brother here just for a second, right? Turn off Fox News. Pick up a newspaper. Leave Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it alone. Get off Facebook and social media, chat, or I don't know what you call it, Instagram, and pick up a legitimate paper. Take a lesson and really delve into the understanding of what does conservatism and freedom mean. And if you figure it out and you have a legitimate answer, email me here at the show. Please do so. Come join me on the show. Let's have a conversation because I want to understand what those two words mean. See, every time I see someone who espouses conservative values, protecting a family, protecting the integrity of businesses, of local autonomy, of schools and education, I hear through translation language such as, we don't want the narrative and the history of black and brown folks taught to students in schools. We don't want folks to know that the KKK was a hostile terrorist group in the state of Texas controlled by Republicans and conservatives. They have essentially outlawed the use through textbooks of the word KKK being associated with terrorism. Get on the internet and type in KKK and black lynchings and then hit image. And when you do that, if that doesn't look like terrorism, if that doesn't really look like conservative values in any way, form, or fashion, then I'm at a loss. It's confusing to me. It's frustrating. And I'll admit, using this mic on this show to pontificate, maybe even a vent a little bit for the fact that I don't know what freedom means. I have no idea what freedom means. We tend to think of freedom as an emancipatory idea, right? Those ideals that are espoused, and with good reason. Throughout history, the desire to be free inspired countless marginalized groups to challenge the rule of political and economic elites. Liberty, at one point, was the buzzword of the Atlantic revolutionaries, right? It drove the French Revolution. Liberty drove the ideals of the American Revolutionary War. Liberty, of course, was put in place in really structuring the Enlightenment document of the United States Constitution. But yet, much like I mentioned with the enslaved, the contradiction of the word freedom has always been paradoxical. I don't know what freedom means because, see, at the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, at the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, there were still enslaved black folks in this country. There are still women who were never granted the franchise. They were, I won't even say disempowered, they were never empowered. There were queer folks. Yes, queer folks existed in the 18th century who couldn't be their true queer selves. And even as they really challenged the status quo to be free today, people still continue to suppress that freedom using a language of conservative family values and freedom. Ron DeSantis, in his anti-woke bill, because queer folks want to live their better life, believing that kids at a young age are too young to really formulate ideas and opinions about their own identity. You know, I'm just going to tell you, as a cis, straight brother, black man here, I remember having a crush on a girl when I was in the 3rd, 4th grade. I do. And that wasn't suppressed. Because is that how people interpret the notion of the right way to think, family values? I don't remember someone stepping in and saying, oh, Eddie, no, 4th grader should ever have a crush on a female. But yet, if Eddie Carson were gay, Someone's now telling me, but you can't think about gayness because you're too young to think about gayness. Almost like it's some type of warped ideological positionality in which a fourth grader is supposed to comprehend and understand. Almost like a fourth grader had some Kool-Aid that gave them a gauging all of a sudden. Now we're talking about the fact that we're going to remove freedom? Ha! Oh, folks, we can go on and on and on and on and on. We think about things such as that notion of liberty and how liberty was used to topple autocratic kings, arrogant elites, slaveholders. I don't know about that. And thus putting an end to things such as the ancien, or some people call it the ancient or old regime, going back to the French Revolution of the 18th century. In the 19th and 20th centuries, black civil rights activists and feminists fought for the expansion of democracy and full citizenship in the name of freedom. That word freedom popping up again, right? We essentially escape one word, liberty, misused, misguided, and we run to another word that's ambiguous because it doesn't really exist in a true form or fashion the way some people think it should. Think about that. Process that for a little bit. And what does all that mean for us? You know, I sit here and I wrestle with these things. And I sit here at times and I struggle and I think, why do people fundamentally have a problem with the actualities of freedom? I was at sitting in a bar once up in New Hampshire, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was Londonderry is the name of the town. And so I was there and I was working on my laptop. And on my laptop, I talked about how we should advocate for the Green New Deal. Socialism may be worth a conversation because it has merit and truth. Black Lives Matter. And this guy walks up to me and he says, hey, that's interesting stuff on your laptop, but I got one question for you. Far away. I'm used to folks walking up to me, asking me questions. And sometimes, in some ways, it's almost like they've never seen a black man who looks like me. He said, do you believe in freedom? Well, absolutely, I believe in freedom, I told him. He said, but do you really believe in freedom? Because, see, I don't think you're espousing freedom. And I stepped back, I looked at him, and I decided, you know what? I got to get this report done. So we're not going to have this conversation because it's not going to happen right now. And I took that conversation with me to think, he's talking about the fact that freedom means one thing for him. Freedom doesn't mean that we should live in a state or a society in which black people feel like they have their freedom to navigate down the street without being harassed by police officers, or they can walk into a store without being followed, or they can go to a bank and get a loan without people being suspicious of them, or they can seek to rent an apartment in Boston or buy a home and be free to do that without the fact that people are going to be suspicious of them. See, those are the things when we think about freedom, we think about the fact that people have the right to exist in their own identity in their own ways. And yet, when I hear freedom, I hear the very opposite of the things that this individual was implying in many ways. But to all of this, there's always another side of the story when it comes to freedom. Over the past 250 years, the cry for liberty has been used by conservatives to defend elite interest, right? Even working class and poor people at times, getting into this class consciousness aspect, tend to align sometimes with elites, with the bourgeoisie, with populations of folks that don't always have their own common interests, but yet they have been bought into this notion that I got to side with the elites because they know what's best. Black lives do not matter. Queer lives do not matter. The fundamental reproductive rights and identity of women do not matter. There's a population of folks in which freedom matters for everyone, and those who set the rule, and that, of course, rests on cis, straight, evangelical Christian white men. They write the rules and they determine what freedom means. And yet, if you don't understand that word, then you're on the opposite side of what the word freedom means. Now, I get it. There are black folks who drink that Kool-Aid too, but not a lot of them. Not a lot of them. People were like, is this a race issue or a class issue? I think it's a combination of both. I think it's a race issue. I think it's a class issue. It's a gender issue. It's a sexual orientation issue. It is all of those things. And yet, if you, in terms of your own positionality, are not on the right side of these things, then you're sitting on the side where people are going to say, oh, that brother Eddie Carson is just too woke. He is too woke because he believes that a transgender woman should live and be her true self, should have the right to marry if she elects to do that, to have children if she elects to do that. That sounds like freedom to me. She has the right to engage in employment, earn a living, rent an apartment, buy a home if she so wants to. How is that woke? How is that woke? See, I hear woke and I think freedom. I think liberty. But yet people are starting to tell me that all those things mean something very, very different from the way the establishment believes it should be. And folks who think they are a part of that establishment, whether it's in terms of class orientation or racial orientation or all of those things that are there, they have been hoodwinked. They have been convinced to align with their oppressors in a way that's not fundamentally necessary, and at the end, it's going to come back and it's going to hunt them, and they're going to lose their soul in that way too. I think a term was coined back in the 70s called Stockholm Syndrome. And when you think about the word Stockholm Syndrome, it's like someone comes in here and holds me and this whole studio here a hostage, and yet over a period of time, we become convinced to to ally, to partner, to side with our oppressors, the kidnappers. I mean, it's puzzling to me. If we really believe in freedom, folks, what is wrong with the fact that we live in a country that rejects the history of black people? What is wrong with teaching the fact that slavery was institutional, it was structured, and one day slaves were free only to be re-enslaved from 1877 to 1965 through a period known as Jim Crow. And then after that period, right, structural elements continue to exist as black folks really work their way to achieve middle class status, particularly in terms of things such as owning a home, getting a good education, having a meaningful job, right? But yet the barriers, the structural barriers are there, and people are now saying, we're not going to teach a course on AP or AP African American Studies because it teaches people the truth about history, and it may make them feel guilty to understand that this country at one point was an oppressive, marginalized, conditionalized institution that we have yet to have an honest, real conversation about. No one wants to do that. Why? Because there's a narrative being propagated by the fact that we should operate from this notion of being colorblind. And by being colorblind, by doing so, we pretend that there are people in society who may not be able-bodied, who may not be straight, who may not be male, privileged, or white, and to understand how the systemic barriers in play keep them from moving forward. The counter side to that argument, people would tell me is, well, Eddie, if you just stop talking about it, it'll go away. Lawrence Bobo, Harvard sociologist, Harvard academic, right, did a big study. And in his survey, white folks said the biggest thing that could happen is if black people stop talking about racism, racism will miraculously and magically just disappear and we can pretend it doesn't happen. Tell that to the folks who can't get the kind of medical care they need, or to rent, buy, own a home, or get employment. Let's talk about freedom once we've done that just a little bit more. I think those are the things that we need to think about, right? So as we think about over the last 250 years in that word liberty that has ascended to the status of freedom, has also been used by not only the elites, whatever the elites are, I'm not going to get into that definition right now, but by those who don't have the kind of property status, economic income, or even folks who align with those people, but yet it doesn't serve their own common humanity or interest. In their view, true freedom is not about collective control over government. It consists of the private enjoyment of one's life. From this perspective, preserving freedom has little to do with making government accountable to the people. Democratically elected majorities, conservatives point out, pose just as much or even more of a threat of personal security and welfare to individual rights, especially the rights to things such as property. Oh, as rapacious kings or greedy elites once did and manifested themselves, we continue to see a modern day 21st century ideological oligarch who convinces people that freedom is the American way of life and it is the American dream. People would say, well, Eddie Carson, brother, you're saying a lot of stuff here, but you must enjoy some semblance of freedom because you're sitting here on WJOPLP Joppa Radio 96.3, and you're espousing an opinion that maybe a lot of people don't agree with. That looks like freedom. It does today, on Tuesday, September the 19th. Call me a week from today. And after a week, call me a month after that. Because, see, if we start to see the enterprise of freedom disappear, we start to burn books. Here in Newburyport, I had to show up at a rally last year as a right-wing group went in and said, we don't want books in this town, nor do we want books in this community that reminds kids that they may actually be gay. Because a kid woke up one day and just decided I'm gay. I get it that gayness, much like blackness at times, has become gentrified, glorified. It's one of those hipster type things, but I don't think that's what we're really talking about here. I think being alert to this history that I'm talking about can help us to understand why today people can use the same word, freedom, to mean two very different things. When conservative politicians such as Rand Paul and advocacy groups such as Freedom Works or the Federalist Society talk about their love of liberty, they usually mean something very different from the civil rights activist, that soul brother named John Lewis, who was beaten during the 1960s civil rights movement just because the brother wanted to vote, arrested, because he believed in what freedom looked like and what freedom meant, folks. I'm just talking about logic and reason and justice here, people. I'm talking about freedom. And I can assure you, Ron DeSantis' definition of freedom does not look like Brother King's definition of freedom. I am pretty sure of that. This past summer in August, the 60th anniversary of the March in Washington took place. And while many remembered the March on Washington as a turning point in the movement for civil rights, that happened back in the year 1963, just in case folks aren't paying attention, fewer know it by its actual name and intention. That march was a march on Washington for jobs And check this out, folks. Oh, I want you to hear this. It was a march for jobs and freedom. That is what was taking place during that time period. Central to the demands of the organizers was the right to a good job. I can pay my bills. Maybe I can send my kids to college because I was denied those rights because of Jim Crow education, Jim Crow laws in a country that professes liberty and freedom, going back to the Enlightenment period here, people. Economic opportunity. The fact that I'd like to have a job that pays me an actual living wage so I can go home at night and sit around a dinner table and maybe hold hands with my family and say a prayer and bless this great meal and wake up recharged to go out the next day. That is not the actualities of freedom for many people. In 1963, when the organizer of the first March on Washington came to D.C., and black ownership rate trailed white Americans by 27%. 1963. Remember now, they just recently celebrated 60 years of the March on Washington. The racial wealth gap then was $121,000. Today, let's talk about freedom. In the 21st century, that racial wealth gap is $161,000, people. $161,000. In Boston, in the greater Boston area, and I've said this and I've mentioned this before, the average amount of wealth for a white home, a white family, is $250,000. For black people, it's $8. Yes, you can look that up. That Boston Spotlight series, they did a deep investigation into the racial disparities in this area are grand. We're not talking about Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, Kentucky, or Texas, folks. We're talking about Massachusetts here. So before liberals out there start saying, oh, brother, no, we are good folks. We welcome the slaves to come up here, or the enslaved once they were running. And we profess abolitionism. Well, until they all start to come and make their way up this way. We are the great liberals. We professed all these things until they moved into the neighborhood. Until they interrupted the wealth that other folks may be earning. Check yourself. Even here in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is no greater in some ways than places like Alabama, although I will say I have no plans to go back to my home state of Alabama anytime soon because, yes, oppression is real there, right? I mean, even a right-wing Supreme Court tells Kay Ivey, she's the governor of the state of Alabama, that no, you can't gerrymander, you can't do these things in terms of oppressing voters with redrawing district lines. Kay Ivey, much like Andrew Jackson, said, let me see 9 people in robes force me what to do. And we know what Andrew Jackson did. He sent troops down and force indigenous folks, American Indians, onto the Trail of Tears. There you go, right there. Another example of American history and that term we have fallen in love with, freedom. See, black Americans still earn less for the same work than white Americans did back in 1963. They are still less likely to receive a fair mortgage or a small business loan here in the 21st century. All of these things, folks, really boil down to notions of freedom. And what does freedom mean? I'm going to leave you with this question here. And here's a question. What does freedom mean to you? Think about that. See, and I'm not going to tell you how to think nor answer that question. I almost did that, and I don't want to do that. What does freedom mean to you? Then ask someone else what freedom means to them. Then find someone who doesn't look like you, who may not live in the same economic bracket that you exist in, what freedom means. If you're a male, ask a woman what freedom means if she's constantly worried about her own reproductive rights being taken from her. White folks, ask a black or brown or indigenous person, what does freedom mean to you? Ask an immigrant. Ask an Asian person, right? Because see, if I hear conservatives pontificate freedom one more time, we don't want to teach black history because we want you to be free. We don't want to talk about people being gay. Florida, right? What was it? Don't say gay bill. And if you disagree with me, Disney, we're going to oppress you. Ooh, a lot of conservative values here, folks, I'm hearing. I'd be curious. I would be curious. This is Race Matters. Y'all listen to Brother Carson up here. And, you know, I got a lot of soul going on tonight because I got a lot on my mind. Oh, I need to get back to finish that next book I need to write. Right? Maybe grab or grade a couple essays. We'll see what's going to happen. And I'll see if I can do that without the interference of this notion of freedom and what freedom means. Hey, I'm just a soul brother who's deeply immersed in a funk. The bad, stinky funk that people carry around in when they espouse freedom, but yet the really good funk that John Coltrane or Miles Davis may advocate for. That's the kind of good funk that I like. All right, folks, be well. This is Race Matters. Signing out. See you next time.